Okay, now we move to discuss how supply and demand in the relevant market determine who ultimately pays the tax. Remember that debates over tax policy can be quite confusing. Consumers are often convinced that they ultimately pay all taxes. Producers, on the other hand, fight hard to prevent any increases of taxes on their, products. So if consumers pay all taxes, then why should firms care if their products are taxed or not? Of course, the answer to this is not that simple. Quite frankly, the correct answer is that who ultimately pays the tax depends on the elasticity of supply and demand in the relevant market. Here, let us, have this. We have here an exercise about the market of cigarettes, and cigarettes is a good example of, an excise. Is a good example of, excise taxes, because an excise tax is a tax that is placed on, certain goods such as alcohol, cigarettes, and a broad range of goods such as food. So this is a good example of, excise tax. Now, in this exercise, as you can see, we have a normally sloped demand and supply. Okay, the initial price of a pack of cigarette is $5. That's before the placement of the tax on producers. Now, when a tax is imposed on the product of cigarettes, okay, the cost of producing cigarettes will increase. Therefore, that will cause the supply curve, of cigarettes to, increase, to supply curve to, shift upward. Okay, that is the supply curve to decrease. That is, it shifts upward, as you can see, from S1 to S2. The vertical distance between S1 and S2 is the amount of the tax, which is $1. So the government places $1, on a pack of cigarettes, okay, and collects the proceeds from what? From the, producers or from the sellers. So the final price, okay, after the imposition of the tax, when the supply curve shifts upward from S1 to S2, is $5.50. As you can see, the price that consumers will pay after the placement of the tax is $5.50. It's not $6. $5.50 is not equal to the, old price, which is $5, and the tax, which is $1, because the old price and plus the tax is $6. However, the new price after the placement of the tax is $5.50, which implies that consumers pay 50 cents or half of the tax. Now, the price that producers receive is, $4.50. It's not this. It's not before the tax. Producers receives $5. Now, after the imposition of the tax, producers receives $4.50. This shows that, that the incidence of the tax, okay, is shared between consumers and the producers. Consumers pay 50% of the tax, and producers pays the other 50%. Okay, so when we say about the incidence of the tax, is the economist term for who really pays the tax. Okay, now, as you can see in this example here, of course, the outcome of this example is not, equal for all other cases. In this case, as you can see, that part of the tax is paid by consumers, and the other part, of course, is paid by producers. Okay. Now, here we have different cases where consumers may pay the entire tax, or producers also could pay the entire tax, depending on the elasticities of the supply or demand. So in case A over here, as you can see, here, as in this case, we have a demand curve, that is perfectly inelastic, okay? And the supply curve is normally slow, okay, is relatively inelastic. So what happens here? Before the tax is imposed, consumers pay $5. After the tax is paid, the new price is $6. So consumers pay $6. They pay the old price plus the tax. The tax is $1. The government places $1 on the product, on each pack of cigarettes. So as you can see, consumers pay the full amount of the tax, okay? Because the new price is $6, which is equal to the old price plus the tax, which is $1. Now, how about in case B? In case B, as you can see, of course, we still the market for cigarettes, okay? And as you can see, along the horizontal axis, we have the pack of cigarettes per day, and along the vertical axis is the price per pack of cigarettes. Now, here in this case, as you can see, the demand is perfectly elastic, okay? And the supply, of course, is normally slow. So when the tax, of course, the initial price or the price before the tax is $5. Now, when the government places $1 of a tax, of course, on the good, then what happens here? Of course, as you can see over here, the supply will shift from S1 to S2. However, because the demand is perfectly elastic, then there is no change in the price. So consumers will continue to pay $5, which means that where's the $1 tax? So which means that producers will end up paying the entire amount of the tax. Okay, they used to receive $5, and after the tax, the imposition of the tax, they still receive $5. Therefore, they have to pay $1. Producers, in this case, will pay the entire tax. Okay, so the incidence of the tax in this case is that falls fully on producers. Now, what about case C? In this case, as you can see, the supply curve is perfectly elastic. Okay, the supply is perfectly elastic, and the demand is normally slow. So the initial price was $5. The initial price of the pack of cigarettes is $5. Now, after the imposition of the tax, okay, which is $1, of course, after the imposition of the tax of $1, the price, the imposition of the tax will cause the supply, to shift upward, because the cost of production increases. Therefore, the supply curve will shift upward from S1 to S2. And as you can see, the new price is $6. So consumers will end up paying the entire tax, okay? The consumers will end up paying the entire tax. In this case, when the supply curve is perfectly elastic. So when the supply curve is perfectly elastic, okay, and the government imposes a tax on cigarettes and collects the proceeds from the producers, however, the consumers will end up paying the whole tax, okay, as you can see from the graph. Now, in figure D over here, shows a perfectly inelastic supply curve, okay? Perfectly inelastic supply curve. Here, sellers will pay the full tax, okay? The incidence of the tax, falls entirely on, producers. As you can see, because the supply curve is perfectly inelastic, when the government places a tax on producers, the price, continue to stay the same, okay, $5. So consumers paid $5 before the tax, and now after the imposition of the tax, continue to pay $5. Therefore, producers will end up paying the entire tax. So when we say here the incidence of the tax falls entirely on producers. So what I'm trying to say here is that the lesson is that here the government may determine the placement of a tax. In other words, the government can say place a tax on consumers or producers. However, supply and demand will eventually determine who pays the tax. Okay? Who pays the tax? The placement of a tax by the government does not guarantee the payment of the tax. Okay? The government could pay the tax on producers, but that doesn't mean that producers will eventually, pay the tax. Okay, now we would like to, of course, study the relationship between tax revenue and the degree of elasticity. Here, actually, we would like to see how the government can maximize its tax revenue. Of course, this is based upon the degree of elasticity of the demand curve. Okay, so here we're going to study, a certain exercise regarding two sellers, one facing a perfectly inelastic demand. Here, as you can see, D1 is the perfectly inelastic demand facing seller 1. And D2, as you can see here, is more or less, elastic demand. It's not perfectly elastic. It's more or less elastic demand here, facing seller 2. Now, as you can see, both sellers face S1, which is a supply curve facing both sellers, seller 1 and seller 2. Now, initially, the equilibrium is at point A for both. Each, of course, producing 1,000 units of the product in question. Now, of course, the government is thinking to place $1, tax per unit of the product on either seller. Of course, it's going to place $1 tax per unit in the products that is, produced by either seller, whether seller 1 or seller 2. Now, if the government places $1 tax per unit in the product sold by, of course, seller 1 that faces D1, which is a perfectly inelastic demand curve, then as a result of the, of this tax, then what happens? The cost of production, of course, increases for seller 1, and therefore it is supply curve will shift upward, okay, by the amount of the tax, of course. Here, for instance, over here, as you can see, it is $1. This is the vertical distance between S1, the initial supply curve before the tax, and S2, the supply curve after the tax, is $1. This is the amount of the tax. Now, when the government imposes $1 tax on the product that is sold by seller 1, then S1 will shift upward to S2. Okay, now the new equilibrium is at B. First, as we see over here, that A is the initial equilibrium for both sellers, and both sell 1,000 units. That's before the tax. Okay, now after imposing the tax on the good that is sold by seller one, then the supply curve shift upward to S2, and the new equilibrium point is at B. And as you can see, the seller one will continue to sell 1,000 units. Now, what is the tax revenue here? After imposing the $1 tax per unit. Of course, tax revenue collected from seller one is equal $1 times that 1 times 1,000 units. And we come up with what? $1,000. Okay, that is for seller one. Now let's see if the government, and the objective of the government is to maximize its tax revenue. So let's see what is the amount of tax revenue that the government can collect from seller two if the government imposes $1 tax on the products sold by seller two. Seller two, as you can see, is not perfectly inelastic. More or less, it is, less inelastic. Okay, so when the government imposes or places $1 tax on the product that is sold by, seller two, then the supply curve, of course, will shift upward, and by the amount of the tax. Of course, the new equilibrium is at point C, over here, and as a result of this, then the seller two will sell 750 units. When supply curve shift upward, of course, it will intersect the demand curve at C, and then so the new equilibrium is 750. So what is the tax revenue collected by the government from seller two? Okay, so tax revenue collected from seller two is equal $1, which is the amount of tax, times the quantity that is sold, by seller two, which is 750 units, and that equals $750. So as you can see over here, that if the government, or if the objective of the government is to maximize tax revenue, then the government should, tax the seller facing the more inelastic demand curve. As you can see, this is more inelastic than this demand here, D1, is more inelastic. D1 is more inelastic curve than, of course, D2. Therefore, the government should, tax seller one with the demand curve that is more inelastic than seller two. So the lesson here is that in order to gain the higher amount of taxes, higher amount of tax revenue, the government should tax the seller, with the more inelastic demand curve.